Good day, dear listeners, it's Clara again. I'm really glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, I want to ask you something simple but important. Where are you listening from today? Leave a comment and tell me your city. I always read them, and it warms my heart to see how far these stories travel across the world. And if you enjoy honest, emotional stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, Sai, let me tell you about the day my life collapsed at 74 years old. I never imagined that after 4 decades of marriage, I would be sitting on a porch swing wondering where I was going to sleep in 2 months. But that's exactly where my story begins. My name is Dorothy Ellison, though most people who know me well simply call me Dot. I lived in the same house for 38 years, a pale yellow house with white shutters in Savannah, Georgia. There was a big magnolia tree in the front yard that smelled sweet every spring, and along the wooden fence I had planted roses with my own hands. Those roses had survived storms, droughts, and even one winter frost that almost killed them, but somehow they always came back. I guess I thought my marriage was like those roses, something strong, something permanent. Funny how life teaches you otherwise. My husband Gerald and I married in 1989. We weren't young then. I was 51 and he was 55. It was a second chance kind of love. Both of us had lived a full life before meeting each other, and I believed we had found something steady and peaceful together. Gerald was a quiet man. He liked routines. Saturday mornings meant mowing the lawn, evenings meant the news playing softly on television, and every night before bed he would look at me and say, "Good night, Dot," in a calm voice that made everything feel safe. For 38 years I believed that voice, but there was another person in our lives, my younger sister, Vera. Vera was 6 years younger than me, and if I'm being honest, she had always lived life differently than I did. While I preferred quiet evenings and careful plans, Vera loved excitement. She had been married twice, divorced twice, and she always carried herself like someone who believed the world still owed her something. Yet she was my sister. When she visited, I cooked for her. When she struggled financially, I helped her. When she needed a place to stay for a few weeks, well, my house always had an extra room. Looking back now, I sometimes laugh quietly to myself, not a happy laugh, the kind of laugh that comes when you realize how blind trust can make you, because the truth is the signs were there, small ones at first. The kind you brush away because you don't want to seem suspicious. Gerald pouring Vera another glass of wine before she even asked, their conversations suddenly stopping when I walked into the room. A glance across the dinner table that lasted just a second longer than it should have. I noticed those things, of course I did, but after 70 years of living, you learn something about yourself. Sometimes you ignore the truth because the alternative is simply too painful to face, so I told myself I was imagining things. Oh, how wrong I was. The day everything changed was a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. The magnolia tree outside the kitchen window had just started blooming, and the house smelled faintly like the roses I had cut that morning and placed in a jar on the table. Gerald stood across from me in the kitchen, arms folded, his face strangely calm. I remember the refrigerator humming behind us, that low, quiet sound, funny, the things your mind remembers when the world is about to break. "Dot," he said slowly, "I think we need to talk." I smiled a little and wiped my hands on a kitchen towel. "About what?" I asked. Then he said the sentence that shattered 38 years of marriage in less than 10 seconds. "I want a divorce," just like that, no warning, no explanation, just those 3 words floating in the quiet kitchen. I stared at him for a long moment. My heart didn't race, the room didn't spin. Instead, everything felt strangely still, like the world had paused for a moment. "Why?" I finally asked. My voice was calm, too calm. Gerald looked directly at me, and what he said next is something I will never forget as long as I live. "Because I've always loved Vera more than you." For a second I thought I had misheard him. My own sister? The idea was so ridiculous it almost sounded like a bad joke, but Gerald didn't smile. His face remained completely serious. "Vera and I have been talking for a while," he continued quietly. "We've decided we want to be together." I felt something deep in my chest, not exactly pain, more like a heavy silence. 38 years of marriage gone in one conversation. "And the house?" I asked softly. Gerald cleared his throat. "My lawyer says the divorce process will take about 60 days, he explained. "You'll need to make arrangements to move. Out of the house I had lived in for nearly 4 decades. The house where my children had celebrated birthdays, where my grandchildren had taken their first steps, where every rose along that fence had been planted by my own hands." I walked slowly out to the porch and sat down on the swing, the same swing Gerald had built for me years ago. The air smelled sweet from the magnolia blossoms, and somewhere down the street a dog barked lazily. Inside the house I could hear Gerald turning on the television like it was any other evening. Imagine that, ending a marriage and then sitting down to watch the news. I sat there for hours as the sun slowly disappeared behind the oak trees across the street. And that was the moment something strange happened. Instead of crying, instead of begging, instead of shouting, I started thinking, because something about Gerald's calmness didn't feel right. The lawyer, the 60-day timeline. The quiet certainty in his voice, this hadn't been a sudden decision. No, this had been planned, carefully, slowly, maybe for months, maybe even longer. And the next morning, when I drove to the bank to check our accounts, that's when I discovered something that made the divorce look like the smallest problem in my life. I wish I could tell you that when I drove to the bank that morning, I still believed everything would somehow make sense, but deep down I already knew something was wrong. When you've lived 74 years on this earth, you develop a strange kind of instinct. A quiet voice inside your mind that whispers when something isn't right, and that morning that voice was loud, very loud. I remember putting on my navy coat, the one I usually wear to church, and driving to the bank before Gerald even woke up. The streets were still calm, the kind of peaceful morning where the air feels cool and the sunlight hasn't fully taken over the sky yet. Normally, I love mornings like that. But that day, my hands felt cold on the steering wheel. At the bank, the young branch manager greeted me politely. Her name was Carla. She had helped me once before with a small paperwork issue, and she recognized me right away. "Good morning, Mrs. Ellison," she said kindly. "How can I help you today?" I smiled, the same polite smile I've used my entire life. "I just need to review my account records," I told her. "All of them." She nodded and pulled up the information on her computer. At first everything looked normal. Our checking account was there, the small savings account too, but when she printed the statements and handed them across the desk, that's when my stomach dropped. The savings account balance was almost empty. I blinked at the paper once, twice, thinking maybe I had read it wrong, but the number stayed the same. Only a few $1,000s left. My voice stayed calm, but inside my chest something tightened. "Could you show me the transfers?" I asked. Carla clicked a few things on her keyboard and printed another page. When she slid it toward me, the pattern became clear immediately. Small transfers every few weeks, sometimes a few $1,000s, sometimes 5,000, each one moving money out of our joint account, quietly, slowly, over the past 14 months. I felt a strange sound escape my throat, not quite laughter, not quite disbelief, more like the sound someone makes when they finally understand the joke everyone else already knew. 14 months. Gerald had been draining our savings for more than a year. "Do you recognize the destination account?" Carla asked carefully. I looked at the numbers and shook my head, but I already had a terrible suspicion forming in my mind. I folded the papers slowly and placed them into my purse. "Thank you," I told her. "You've been very helpful." When I walked back out into the morning air, the sun had finally risen. The city was waking up. Cars passed by. People hurried along sidewalks with coffee cups in their hands. Everything looked completely normal. But my life had quietly been dismantled piece by piece while I was planting roses and cooking dinner. When I arrived home, Gerald was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee like any other morning. "You're up early," he said casually. I nodded and poured myself a cup without answering. I watched him carefully for a moment. The man I had lived beside for 38 years, the man who had kissed my cheek every Christmas morning, and suddenly I realized something painful. I didn't really know him at all. He had been planning this. The divorce, the money transfers. Everything. I said nothing about the bank, not yet. Instead, I simply drank my coffee and listened to the quiet ticking of the kitchen clock. Sometimes silence reveals more than questions. Later that afternoon, I called my daughter Margaret. She lives in Atlanta and works as a real estate attorney, which means she has a mind that notices details most people miss. When I told her what Gerald had said the night before, there was a long pause on the phone. "Mom," she finally said carefully, "don't move anything in that house, don't change accounts, don't sign anything." Her voice had that sharp professional tone she uses in court. "Why?" I asked. "Because something about this doesn't feel right." I almost laughed hearing that. "You're a little late for that realization," I said quietly. Then I told her about the bank transfers. Another long silence. "Mom," she said finally, "you need a lawyer, immediately." The truth is, I had already started thinking the same thing. That evening I made another phone call, this one to my oldest friend Alina. Alina and I have known each other for 40 years. She's the kind of friend who answers the phone even when it rings at strange hours. "Ellie," I said when she picked up, "I need the name of your divorce lawyer." She didn't ask questions. "Not one. That's how you know someone truly cares about you." She simply gave me the name and address. That night, Gerald stayed out late, probably with Vera. I didn't ask. Instead, I sat at the small oak writing desk in our bedroom and began making a list on a yellow legal pad. I've always made lists when life becomes overwhelming. It helps organize the chaos in your mind. At the top of the page, I wrote 3 simple headings: what I have, what I don't have, what I need to find out. Under the first heading, I wrote the house. I had purchased the house 3 years before Gerald and I got married. Back then, it had been completely mine. Later, after our wedding, Gerald asked if I would add his name to the deed. Just to show we're building this life together, he had said. I remember signing that paper at the very desk where I now sat. I had never imagined that one signature would someday become a weapon against me. Under the second heading, I wrote money, or more accurately, the lack of it. Gerald had always handled the finances. I trusted him completely. Now I understood how dangerous trust without verification can be. Then under the final heading, I wrote something simple. Everything. I needed to find out everything. Because if Gerald had been quietly moving money for 14 months, then the divorce wasn't the real betrayal. The real betrayal had started long before that conversation in the kitchen. And right in the middle of this story, let me pause for a moment and ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply that you never questioned what they were doing behind the scenes? If you enjoy listening to real stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story we share here. Now, where was I? Yes. The next morning, I walked into a small law office downtown. The lawyer's name was Patricia Holt. She was in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a desk covered in neatly organized files. When I finished explaining everything, she leaned back in her chair and looked at the bank records I had brought with me. "Mrs. Ellison," she said calmly, "your husband didn't just plan a divorce." She tapped the papers with her pen. "He planned to leave you with nothing." I felt a quiet chill move through my chest hearing those words. But Patricia wasn't finished speaking yet. She turned another page of the bank records, studying something carefully, and then she looked up at me with an expression that made my heart skip. "And the account receiving this money," she said slowly, "belongs to someone you know very well." When Patricia said those words, the room suddenly felt much smaller. I remember staring at her desk, at the yellow legal pad in front of her, at the bank statements neatly spread across the table, and thinking, please don't say it. Please let it be someone else, anyone else, but deep down sigh I already knew. Patricia adjusted her glasses and turned the paper so I could see the name clearly printed on the account information. Vera Louise Granger, my sister. For a moment I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because sometimes the truth is so painful that your mind reacts in strange ways. My own sister, the same sister who sat in my kitchen drinking coffee. The same sister who hugged me at Christmas. The same sister who called me Dot with that soft voice I had trusted my entire life. 14 months of transfers, money slowly moving from our joint account straight into her hands. I looked at Patricia and shook my head slowly. "Well," I said quietly, "I suppose that answers a lot of questions." Patricia nodded calmly. She had probably seen situations like this many times before. "Your husband has transferred $71,850 into your sister's account over the past 14 months, she explained, "and based on the timing of these transfers, it appears he was preparing financially for the divorce." I sat back in the chair and sighed deeply. $71,000, that wasn't just money, that was years of careful saving, years of skipped vacations and repaired appliances instead of buying new ones, years of thinking we were building a future together. Patricia watched me quietly for a moment, probably expecting tears or anger, but strangely I felt neither. Instead I felt something colder, something clearer. "So what happens now?" I asked calmly. Patricia leaned forward slightly. "Now," she said, "we make sure your husband understands that planning a divorce by secretly moving marital money is not going to end well for him." For the first time since that terrible Tuesday afternoon in my kitchen, I felt a small flicker of control return to my life. Over the next few days, Patricia began gathering more information. She requested financial records, she prepared legal documents, and she explained something important to me. Because the money had been transferred from a joint marital account without my knowledge, it could legally be considered dissipation of marital assets. In simpler terms, Gerald had tried to hide money that partly belonged to me. And the court would not look kindly on that. Meanwhile, life inside the house continued in a strange, uncomfortable silence. Gerald still slept in the same bedroom. We still passed each other in the kitchen. But now every small action felt different. Every word felt calculated. One evening I was standing at the stove cooking a simple dinner when Gerald walked into the kitchen. "You've been quiet lately," he said casually. I stirred the soup slowly and shrugged. "I've been thinking," I replied. He studied me for a moment like he was trying to read my thoughts. "There's no reason for this divorce to become messy," he continued carefully. "We can handle things privately." I almost smiled hearing that, privately, after secretly transferring $70,000 to my sister. "I've already spoken to an attorney," I said calmly. Gerald froze for half a second. It was a very small reaction, but after 38 years of marriage I noticed it immediately. "Oh," he said. "Who?" I turned to face him. "Patricia Holt." For the first time since our divorce conversation, I saw genuine tension appear on Gerald's face. His jaw tightened slightly. He knew exactly who she was. That told me something important. My quiet, predictable husband had clearly done more research about divorce lawyers than he wanted me to believe. The next few days became a silent chess match. Gerald spent more time on the phone in other rooms. Sometimes I heard him speaking quietly late at night. I didn't need to guess who he was talking to. Vera had stopped visiting the house entirely. Funny how that works. For years she had practically lived in my guest room. Now suddenly she was nowhere to be found. But the real confrontation came one afternoon about a week later. I was outside in the garden trimming my roses when a car pulled into the driveway. Gerald stepped out of the passenger side, and Vera stepped out of the driver's seat. I stood there holding my pruning shears while they walked toward me together. For a brief moment I considered going inside and closing the door. But no, I had spent too many years avoiding uncomfortable truths. I wasn't going to start now. Gerald spoke first. "We thought it would be better if we talked openly," he said. Vera gave me a small, careful smile. The same smile she had used her entire life whenever she wanted something from me. She said softly, "this situation doesn't have to turn into a war." I looked at her quietly, my younger sister, the girl whose hair I had braided when we were children. The woman who had now taken $70,000 from my marriage. "You're right," I said calmly. "It didn't have to become a war." For a moment none of us spoke, then Gerald cleared his throat. "We're willing to make a settlement," he said. 60% of the house value goes to you. We split everything else fairly and avoid court." 60% of the house I had bought before he ever moved in. I almost laughed again. "That's very generous of you," I said quietly. Vera stepped closer, her voice becoming softer. "Think about the family," she said. "Dragging this into court will only hurt everyone." There it was, the word family. Funny how people only remember family when they need forgiveness. I looked directly at her. "Did family matter when you were accepting those bank transfers?" I asked calmly. Vera's smile disappeared instantly. Gerald's expression hardened. "You went to the bank," he said. "Yes," I replied. Another long silence settled over the garden. Then Gerald's voice became colder. "If you continue pushing this legally," he said slowly, "things could become unpleasant." I tilted my head slightly. "Unpleasant how?" Gerald glanced briefly at Vera before speaking again. "Our attorney believes we could challenge your mental competence," he said. "You are 74 after all." For a moment I felt a small chill pass through my chest. The idea of someone questioning my mind in court, humiliating me publicly, it was a cruel tactic. But the fear lasted only a few seconds, then something else replaced it: determination. I placed the pruning shears down on the garden table and looked directly at both of them. "You should leave my property now," I said calmly. Gerald frowned. "Your property?" I smiled slightly. "Yes," I said. "My property." They left a few minutes later without another word. I stood in the garden long after their car disappeared down the street. The roses swayed gently in the breeze like they always did, but now I understood something important. Gerald and Vera believed I would eventually give up. They believed I would get tired, scared, embarrassed, and simply walk away. But what they didn't understand yet was that Patricia had just discovered something in the financial records that would make their situation far worse than either of them imagined. The evening after Gerald and Vera left my garden, I sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time. The house felt strangely quiet, almost like it was holding its breath. I kept thinking about the way Gerald had looked when he threatened to question my mental competence in court. Imagine that. 38 years of marriage, and suddenly I was just a confused old woman in his story. I sighed and rubbed my temples. Life has a funny way of revealing people's true character when money and comfort are involved. The next morning I drove back to Patricia's office with a folder of documents I had gathered overnight. Old tax returns, bank statements, the original deed paperwork from when I first bought the house, everything I could find. Patricia looked impressed when I placed the stack on her desk. "You've done more preparation in one night than some clients do in 6 months," she said. I gave a small, tired smile. "When someone threatens to say you've lost your mind, it's amazing how motivated you become." Patricia nodded thoughtfully and began reviewing the documents. The room was quiet except for the sound of papers turning and her pen making small notes on the legal pad. After several minutes she leaned back slightly in her chair. "Mrs. Ellison," she said carefully, "your husband made a very serious mistake." That caught my attention immediately. "What kind of mistake?" I asked. Patricia slid one particular document across the desk toward me. It was a timeline she had created showing every transfer Gerald had made to Vera's account. Dates, amounts, totals. 14 months of quiet withdrawals. "If we present this correctly in court," Patricia explained, "the judge will likely view this as intentional financial misconduct during a marriage." I blinked slowly. "Meaning?" Patricia smiled faintly. "Meaning the court may compensate you far more than the amount he transferred." Now that I did not expect. For the first time in weeks I felt a small spark of hope flicker inside me. Not revenge, just fairness. Patricia continued outlining the legal strategy. She would file a contested divorce claim. She would formally document the financial transfers. And she would request records of communication between Gerald and Vera. You think they actually discussed the transfers? I asked. Patricia shrugged slightly. People planning something secret often become careless after a while. She closed the folder neatly. We're going to find out. As the days passed, something interesting began happening inside the house. Gerald became restless. I could see it in the way he moved through the rooms, in the way he checked his phone constantly, in the way he watched me carefully whenever I walked past him. He knew something had changed, he just didn't know what. One evening he approached me in the living room while I was reading. "We should talk about resolving this situation," he said stiffly. I looked up from my book slowly. "We already talked," I replied calmly. "Yes, but you seem to be escalating things," he said, escalating. That word almost made me chuckle. "Gerald," I said gently, "you transferred $70,000 from our savings to my sister and then asked me to leave my own house. I'm not escalating anything. I'm responding." His face tightened slightly. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be." I closed my book and looked directly at him. "No," I said quietly. "You made it difficult the moment you started moving money behind my back." He didn't respond after that. Instead, he simply turned and walked out of the room. But the real turning point came about 10 days later when Patricia called me. I was in the garden watering my roses when my phone rang. "Mrs. Ellison," she said immediately, "I've received the subpoena records." My heart began beating a little faster. "And," I asked, there was a brief pause on the line. "You were correct about the coordination between your husband and your sister," Patricia said. I slowly sat down on the garden bench. "How bad is it?" I asked quietly. Patricia's voice remained calm, but I could hear the sharp focus behind her words. "We now have text messages between them discussing the transfers." My stomach tightened. "Text messages?" "Yes," she confirmed. "Several of them." I stared out at the fence where my roses were blooming in neat rows. The afternoon sun was warm, the breeze gentle, yet my chest felt heavy hearing those words. "What do they say?" I asked softly. Patricia read one message aloud. "Gerald wrote to Vera, moved another 4,000 today, don't touch it yet until everything is finalized." I closed my eyes for a moment, $4,000 at a time. Quietly siphoned away while we were still sharing breakfast every morning, Patricia continued. "Another message from Vera says, what if she notices before the divorce?" I laughed quietly, a sad laugh. The kind that escapes when betrayal becomes almost absurd. "Well," I said slowly, "I suppose she finally noticed." Patricia didn't laugh. "These messages are extremely important," she explained. "They demonstrate clear intent. Planning, coordination. It was all there in black and white. 38 years of marriage reduced to a handful of text messages about secret bank transfers. That evening when Gerald came home, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. He paused when he saw me watching him. "Something on your mind?" he asked. I tilted my head slightly. "Just thinking," I said, "about how interesting text messages can be." His expression changed instantly. "Very subtle but unmistakable." "Text messages?" he repeated carefully. I nodded. "Yes, they can reveal a lot about people's intentions." Gerald didn't say another word, he simply walked upstairs. That night I slept more peacefully than I had in weeks, not because the situation was solved, but because the truth was finally visible. Gerald and Vera had spent 14 months planning my exit from the life I built. 14 months believing I would never discover what they were doing, but now the evidence was real, and soon, very soon, a judge would be looking at it too. What Gerald didn't realize yet was that the courtroom hearing was approaching fast. And once those text messages were presented, the story he had carefully constructed about me would begin to fall apart in front of everyone. A few days after Patricia told me about the text messages, the atmosphere in my house changed again. You can feel tension in a house the way you feel a storm coming before it rains. The air gets heavier. Conversations become shorter. Even footsteps sound different. Gerald was watching me constantly now, not openly, but in those small, quiet ways people watch when they're worried about what you might know. Sometimes I would walk into a room and he would suddenly end a phone call. Other times he would stare at me like he was trying to measure something behind my eyes. After 38 years together, it was strange seeing him look at me like I was a stranger. But the truth was, maybe we had always been strangers. One evening I was sitting on the porch swing watching the sunset when Gerald stepped outside and stood near the railing. The sky was turning orange behind the oak trees, and the magnolia blossoms smelled sweet in the warm air. Normally it would have been a peaceful moment, but nothing about our life was peaceful anymore. He said finally, his voice unusually careful, "I think we need to settle this situation before it gets out of hand." I rocked the swing slowly. "It's already out of hand," I replied calmly. He sighed and leaned against the porch railing. "You're pushing things into court," he said. "That's going to create unnecessary problems for everyone." I looked at him quietly. "Everyone," I repeated. "Yes," he said, "the family. The grandchildren, your daughter, everyone." Ah, there it was again, the word family. Funny how people remember family only when they need mercy. I turned my head slightly and studied him. "Did family matter when you were moving money to Vera's account?" I asked softly. Gerald's face tightened. "You keep bringing that up like it's some kind of crime," he said. I almost laughed. "Because it is." For a moment neither of us spoke. The porch swing creaked gently as it moved. Finally Gerald straightened his shoulders. "We're offering a new settlement," he said, 65% of the house value. "And $15,000 to help you relocate." Relocate, such a polite word for being thrown out of your own home. I let out a quiet sigh and shook my head slowly. "No," Gerald blinked in surprise. "You didn't even think about it." "I did think about it," I replied calmly, for about 3 seconds. His jaw tightened again. "Be reasonable." I smiled slightly. Reasonable would have been not transferring $70,000 to my sister. That conversation ended quickly after that. Gerald walked back inside the house without another word. But something in his expression told me he was becoming nervous, and nervous people make mistakes. The next afternoon my phone rang again. It was Patricia. "Mrs. Ellison," she said, "I've received additional records." I sat down at the kitchen table. "More text messages?" I asked. "Yes," she confirmed, "and they're even more revealing." My chest felt tight again as I waited. Patricia continued speaking carefully. "One message from your husband says, 'Once the divorce is done, we can move forward properly.' Another message discusses transferring larger amounts after the property settlement." I closed my eyes for a moment. They weren't just hiding money, they were planning their future together with it. My husband and my sister. I shook my head slowly and let out a long sigh. "You know," I said quietly, "I spent years worrying about whether Vera felt lonely after her divorces." Patricia didn't respond. Lawyers often understand that silence is sometimes the most respectful response. After a moment she continued. "There's something else you should know," she said. My stomach tightened again. "What now?" Patricia paused briefly. "Gerald's attorney has filed a preliminary statement suggesting concerns about your mental competency." For a moment I simply stared at the wall in front of me. There it was, the threat Gerald had made in the garden. Now it was real. "They're actually doing it?" I asked quietly. "They're attempting to," Patricia replied calmly, "but based on the evidence we have, it's not a strong strategy for them." I rubbed my forehead slowly. "Being betrayed by your husband hurts. Being betrayed by your sister hurts even more. But having someone try to declare you mentally incompetent, that kind of humiliation is something different entirely." Patricia must have sensed the weight of my silence because she spoke again gently. "Mrs. Ellison, how are you feeling about all of this?" I thought about that question for a moment, then I surprised myself by laughing softly. "Not bitterly, just tired. Honestly," I said, "I feel very awake." Patricia chuckled quietly. "Good," she said, "because the hearing is coming soon." After the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table staring out the window for a long time. The roses along the fence were blooming brighter every day. I had planted every one of those bushes myself, trimmed them every spring, watered them every summer, protected them during storms, and suddenly a strange thought crossed my mind. Those roses had survived 30 years of weather, drought, frost, heat, and here I was thinking I might not survive one divorce. I shook my head and laughed again. Ridiculous. Life had already thrown worse things at me than this. A little later that evening, Gerald walked into the kitchen again. He looked tense, careful, like someone approaching a wild animal that might bite. "My attorney says we should try mediation," he said. I looked up at him slowly. "Mediation, yes," he replied quickly. "We can sit down with a neutral third party and resolve things quietly." I studied him for a moment. The confident man who had calmly told me he loved my sister now looked uneasy. "Interesting?" "No," I said again. His shoulders stiffened. "You're being stubborn." "No," I replied gently. "I'm being patient." Gerald frowned. "Patient for what?" I lifted my teacup and took a small sip before answering. For the courtroom, his expression changed instantly. Fear, real fear, flashed across his face for just a moment before he turned away. That was when I realized something important. Gerald and Vera had believed this entire plan would go smoothly. They thought I would be embarrassed, tired, maybe even scared enough to accept whatever settlement they offered. But now the evidence was building, the text messages, the financial records, the timeline Patricia had created. Everything was slowly coming together. And soon, very soon, we would all be sitting inside a courtroom where those messages would be read out loud for everyone to hear. But what Gerald didn't know yet was that Patricia had discovered one more piece of evidence hidden deep inside those phone records, something that would completely destroy the story he planned to tell the judge. The week before the preliminary hearing was strangely quiet, too quiet. Gerald barely spoke to me anymore. We moved through the house like two strangers sharing a waiting room before some uncomfortable appointment. Sometimes I would hear him pacing upstairs late at night, the floorboards creaking softly as he walked back and forth. Other times he would leave early in the morning and return long after sunset. I didn't ask where he went. I already knew the answer, Vera. Funny thing about betrayal, once you see it clearly, the little details stop surprising you. But while the house stayed silent, Patricia's office was very busy. Subpoenas had been sent. Phone records had been reviewed. Financial timelines had been built piece by piece like a puzzle finally coming together. And then one afternoon Patricia called again. I remember the moment clearly because I was standing in the garden with dirt on my hands, planting a new rose bush near the fence. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I answered, Patricia's voice sounded different, focused, almost satisfied. "Mrs. Ellison," she said, "I believe we have everything we need." I wiped my hands on a cloth and sat down on the garden bench. "Everything?" I asked. "Yes," she replied, "including the final piece of the timeline." My heart began beating faster. "What timeline?" Patricia explained calmly. "We now know exactly when the financial transfers began and exactly when the communication between your husband and Vera increased." I waited quietly. "The transfers started 14 months ago," she continued, "and the text messages between them began increasing at the exact same time." I sighed slowly. That meant something very simple. The relationship between my husband and my sister hadn't been a sudden emotional accident. It had been building for over a year while they quietly moved money behind my back. "So it was all planned," I said softly. "Yes," Patricia confirmed, "and we can prove it." I sat there looking at the roses for a long moment. The breeze moved gently through the leaves, and for a strange second I felt calm, almost peaceful. When betrayal becomes undeniable, your mind stops searching for excuses. Patricia continued speaking. "There's another message I want you to hear," she said. My chest tightened again. "Go ahead." Patricia read the text slowly. "Gerald wrote, 'Once the house situation is finished, everything will finally be ours.'" Ours, that one word said everything. Not his, not shared. Ours, him and Vera. My husband and my sister building a future together using the money we had saved as a married couple. I let out a long sigh. 38 years, I whispered, and that's what it became. Patricia remained quiet for a moment before continuing. "The judge assigned to your case has a reputation for being very strict with financial misconduct," she said. "These records will be difficult for Gerald to explain." For the first time since this nightmare began, I allowed myself to imagine the possibility of justice. Not revenge, just fairness. That evening, Gerald came home earlier than usual. I was sitting in the living room reading when he walked in. He looked tired, more tired than I had ever seen him before. He stood in the doorway for a moment like he wanted to say something but didn't know where to start. Finally, he cleared his throat. "The hearing is next week," he said. I looked up calmly. "Yes." He shifted his weight slightly. "This could get very public." "Yes," I repeated. Another pause filled the room. Then Gerald spoke again, his voice lower this time. "You still have time to reconsider the settlement." I closed my book slowly. "Why?" I asked. He frowned. "Why what? Why are you suddenly worried about settling?" I asked gently. Gerald didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window for a moment like he was searching for the right words. "Courtrooms can be unpredictable," he said finally. I almost smiled hearing that. Unpredictable. That was a very polite way of saying things might not go his way anymore. "You should have thought about unpredictability 14 months ago," I replied quietly. Gerald's jaw tightened again. "You're enjoying this," he said bitterly. I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I'm enduring it." He stared at me for a moment longer before turning and walking upstairs. Later that night, after the house had gone quiet, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The clock ticked softly on the wall. Outside, the magnolia tree moved gently in the wind. I thought about the first time Gerald had called me Dot. I thought about the vacations we took, the birthdays, the quiet evenings watching television together. All those memories suddenly felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's life. Have you ever had that feeling, when the story you believed about your life suddenly changes and you realize you were reading the wrong chapter all along? If you enjoy listening to real emotional stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. There are many more stories waiting to be told here. I finished my tea and placed the cup in the sink. In just a few days, we would all be sitting in a courtroom where the truth would finally be spoken out loud. Gerald believed he had prepared carefully. Vera believed their plan had been clever, but neither of them understood something important yet. Patricia had built a timeline so precise that every transfer, every message, every quiet conversation between them would be laid out for the judge to see. And once that happened, their carefully built story about a simple divorce would collapse completely. What Gerald didn't know yet was that when those text messages were read in court, the judge would ask him one very simple question. A question he would not be able to answer. and that single moment would change the entire direction of the case. The morning of the preliminary hearing arrived quietly, almost strangely calm. I woke up before sunrise and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching the pale light slowly creep through the window. The house felt different that day, like it already knew something important was about to happen. For weeks, everything had been building toward this moment. The bank transfers, the text messages, the silent tension in every room. And now the truth was finally going to be spoken out loud in a courtroom. I wore a simple gray suit that morning, nothing dramatic, just something neat and respectful. When you're 74 years old, you learn that dignity often speaks louder than anger. Gerald left the house without saying a word. I heard the front door close, the car engine start, and then the driveway became quiet again. I took a slow breath, picked up my folder of documents, and drove downtown to the courthouse. Patricia was already waiting for me outside the courtroom when I arrived. She looked exactly the same as always, calm, organized, and completely focused. "Good morning, Mrs. Ellison," she said. "How are you feeling?" I considered that question for a moment. "Steady," I answered. She nodded approvingly. "Good. That's exactly what we need today." The courtroom itself was simple: wooden benches, tall windows letting in soft morning light, and a long desk where the judge would sit. Gerald was already there with his attorney. I noticed something immediately when I saw him. He looked tense, not the calm, confident man who had told me weeks ago that I would need to leave my house within 60 days. No, this Gerald looked like someone who had started realizing his plan might not work the way he expected. Vera was not present that morning, but her name was written across nearly every document sitting on Patricia's table. The hearing began with the usual formalities. Gerald's attorney spoke first, presenting their argument that the house should be divided as marital property and that Gerald had contributed financially during our marriage. His voice was smooth and confident. I suppose that's what lawyers are trained to do, tell a story that sounds reasonable. But then Patricia stood up. She placed a neat stack of papers on the table and began explaining the financial records slowly and clearly. Every transfer, every date, every amount of money that had quietly moved from our joint savings account into Vera's account. The courtroom grew very quiet as she spoke. Gerald's attorney tried to interrupt twice, but the judge allowed Patricia to continue. Then Patricia did something that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. She picked up another document. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "we would also like to submit communication records between Mr. Ellison and the recipient of these transfers." I glanced at Gerald. His expression shifted instantly. Not dramatically, but enough for anyone paying attention to notice. Patricia read the first message out loud. "Moved another 4,000 today. Don't touch it until everything is finalized." The room became even quieter. The judge looked down at the paper for a moment, then back up at Gerald. "Mr. Ellison," she said calmly, "were you aware that these funds came from a joint marital account?" Gerald shifted slightly in his chair. "I was helping a family member," he said carefully. Patricia didn't argue. She simply placed another document on the table. "And was your wife aware of these transfers?" she asked. Gerald hesitated, just for a second. But in a courtroom, 1 second of hesitation can feel like an hour. "She understood I sometimes assisted family," he said finally. Patricia nodded once. Then she read another message aloud. "What happens if she finds the account before the divorce?" The words hung in the air for several seconds. The judge's expression changed slightly, not angry but sharper, more attentive. Gerald's attorney requested a short recess after that. In the hallway outside the courtroom, the tension was thick. I could hear Gerald speaking urgently to his lawyer at the other end of the corridor. Their voices were low but intense. Patricia stood beside me reviewing her notes calmly. "They didn't expect us to have the text messages," she said quietly. I nodded. That much was obvious. When we returned to the courtroom, Gerald's attorney spoke again, but this time his tone had changed. The confident narrative about simple marital property was gone. Instead, he suggested that both sides might consider discussing a negotiated settlement. Patricia glanced at me briefly. I gave a small nod. She turned back to the judge. "Mrs. Ellison is open to reviewing a full settlement proposal," she said calmly. "However, it must address the complete financial record presented today." The judge scheduled another court date 3 weeks later to allow time for negotiations. The hearing ended shortly after that. As we walked out of the courtroom, Gerald passed by me without making eye contact. For 38 years, we had shared a life together, and now we couldn't even look at each other. Outside the courthouse, the spring air felt fresh and bright. I stood on the steps for a moment, just breathing it in. Patricia closed her folder and looked at me. "That went very well," she said. I nodded slowly. "Yes, it did, but the case wasn't finished yet." Gerald still had 3 weeks before the next hearing. 3 weeks to decide whether he wanted to continue fighting or accept the reality that his carefully planned betrayal had finally been exposed. And during those 3 weeks, something interesting began happening. Gerald's attorney started sending settlement proposals to Patricia's office. The first offer was modest, the second was higher. By the third proposal, it became very clear that Gerald was trying desperately to avoid returning to that courtroom. But there was one condition in every proposal that Patricia immediately rejected. Each settlement required me to drop the fraud claim completely. In other words, Gerald wanted to return the money quietly and pretend none of this had ever happened. I smiled when Patricia explained that detail. Because after everything that had happened, I had absolutely no intention of pretending this story never existed. And the night before the final court date, Gerald's lawyer sent one last settlement proposal. This one was very different from the others, so different that when Patricia read it to me on the phone, I actually had to ask her to repeat the numbers twice, because suddenly, Gerald wasn't just offering to return the money anymore. He was offering something much bigger than that. The night before the next court date was surprisingly quiet. The house felt calm in a way it hadn't felt for months. Maybe it was because the waiting was almost over. Or maybe it was because Gerald had finally realized that the story he carefully planned was no longer under his control. Earlier that evening, Patricia had called me to explain the newest settlement proposal Gerald's attorney had sent. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with the phone in my hand while she read the details slowly. "They're offering to relinquish Gerald's claim to the house," she said first. I blinked. "Completely?" I asked. "Yes," she confirmed. "Full transfer of ownership to you." I leaned back in my chair and let out a quiet breath. That alone was something I had hoped for, but not something I expected Gerald to give up so easily. But Patricia wasn't finished speaking. "They're also offering to return the full $71,850 that was transferred to Vera." That part made sense. It was the exact amount Patricia had documented in court, but then Patricia continued. "In addition, they're offering a settlement payment of $120,000. For a moment I thought I had misheard her. $120,000, I repeated. "Yes," she said calmly. I couldn't help it, a small laugh escaped my mouth. Not a happy laugh exactly, more like the sound someone makes when reality suddenly changes direction. Just a few weeks earlier, Gerald had calmly told me I would need to move out of my own house. Now suddenly he was offering to give it back along with nearly $200,000. Funny how the truth can change a negotiation. "But there's still a condition," Patricia added. Of course there was. "They want you to sign a release of the fraud claim," she explained, "meaning the financial misconduct would not remain part of the public court record." I nodded slowly even though she couldn't see me through the phone. Gerald didn't just want to settle, he wanted to erase what he had done. I sat quietly for a moment thinking about it. The house, the returned savings, the additional settlement money. On paper it looked like a complete victory. But there was something else I needed to consider. "What do you think?" I asked Patricia. Patricia answered carefully. "Financially, the offer is very strong, but ethically that's something only you can decide." After we hung up the phone, I stayed at the kitchen table for a long time. The house was silent except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. I looked around the room slowly. The blue tile backsplash I had chosen years ago. The small painting my daughter Margaret gave me. The window that overlooked the garden where my roses were blooming. This house wasn't just property. It was nearly 4 decades of my life, and Gerald had almost taken it away without a second thought. I sighed deeply and rubbed my hands together. Have you ever faced a decision where both options felt right in different ways? Accepting the settlement would protect my home and restore my finances immediately. But allowing the fraud claim to disappear would also allow Gerald and Vera to quietly walk away from the consequences of what they had done. I stood up and walked slowly onto the porch. The evening air was warm and the magnolia tree was full of blossoms. I sat on the swing and rocked gently back and forth, just thinking. 38 years of marriage, 14 months of secret transfers. One courtroom hearing that had changed everything, and now the final decision was mine. As I sat there, I thought about something Alina had said to me a few weeks earlier when she brought over dinner. "The people who try to push you down are always hoping you'll feel alone," she told me. She was right. Gerald and Vera had counted on me being embarrassed, tired, maybe even scared enough to give up quietly. But I wasn't alone. My daughter had supported me, my friends had supported me, and Patricia had built a case strong enough to bring the truth into the open. That thought brought a small smile to my face. If you're enjoying this story so far, I want to pause for a moment and say thank you for listening. Stories like this remind us how strong people can be even in difficult moments. If you like hearing stories about resilience, justice, and unexpected twists in life, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Now, let me tell you what happened next. The following morning, I met Patricia at her office before the scheduled court session. She had the settlement documents prepared and laid neatly across her desk. "Have you made your decision?" she asked gently. I looked at the papers carefully. Every clause was clear. The house would return entirely to my name, the savings would be restored, the additional settlement payment would be made through Gerald's financial accounts, but one line remained the same. Full release of the fraud claim. I lifted my eyes and looked at Patricia. "Yes," I said calmly. She nodded slowly, waiting for me to continue. "But there's one condition," I added. Patricia raised an eyebrow slightly. "Which is," I folded my hands together on the desk, "the house transfer must be completed and recorded before I sign anything else." Patricia smiled immediately. "That's a very wise condition." She leaned back in her chair slightly. "I'll make sure that happens." And that's exactly what she did. 10 days later, I sat in a title office downtown watching the paperwork finalize the transfer of the house back into my name. When the clerk handed me the official copy of the recorded deed, I held it in my hands for a moment and simply stared at it. One piece of paper representing 38 years of my life. Dorothy Ellison, sole owner. I let out a long breath I didn't realize I had been holding. After that, signing the settlement agreement felt almost easy. Gerald never looked at me during the final meeting. He simply signed the documents and left the room quickly. I suppose some people prefer not to look at the consequences of their actions. Within a few weeks, the divorce was finalized. The money was transferred into my account. The house remained mine, and for the first time in months, my life became quiet again. I thought that was the end of the story. I truly did. I believed the worst chapter of my life had finally closed. But about 3 months later, on a calm September afternoon, my phone rang. The voice on the other end introduced himself as a lawyer calling from Nashville, and the words he said next were so unbelievable, I actually had to ask him to repeat the number twice. Because according to that lawyer, someone from my distant past had just left me an inheritance worth $89 million. For a long moment after the divorce was finalized, life became quiet again. Not the uncomfortable silence that had filled the house during those tense weeks with Gerald, but a peaceful kind of quiet. The kind that lets your mind finally rest. Gerald had moved out a few weeks before the paperwork was completed. His things were gone, his car was gone, and the house slowly began to feel like mine again. I remember the first morning I woke up alone after everything was finished. The sunlight came through the curtains exactly the same way it had for years, but something inside the house felt lighter. I walked into the kitchen, made myself a cup of coffee, and stood by the window looking out at the garden. The roses were blooming beautifully that summer. Red ones, soft pink ones, and the pale yellow variety I planted nearly 20 years ago. I had planted every single one of them myself. For months I had been afraid I might lose this house, but now here I was, standing in the same kitchen I had painted with my own hands decades ago. I let out a small breath and whispered to myself, "Well, you made it." Sometimes survival is quieter than people expect. It doesn't always look dramatic or heroic. Sometimes it just looks like a woman standing in her kitchen at 74 years old realizing she didn't break after all. The settlement money had already been deposited into my account, along with the restored savings Gerald had secretly transferred to Vera. Patricia had structured everything carefully so the payments were properly documented and protected. I called Margaret the evening the final transfer cleared. "It's done," I told her. She was silent for a moment on the phone. Then I heard her sigh in relief. "Everything?" she asked. "Everything," I replied. "The house is mine again, the money is back, it's finished." She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes after weeks of tension finally releases. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said. "That meant more to me than any settlement check ever could." Over the next few weeks, I started doing small things around the house again. I rearranged the living room furniture. I repainted the kitchen a soft sage green that I had always wanted but never chosen before. I extended the rose beds along the back fence and planted 2 new bushes that the garden shop owner promised would bloom for decades. Eleanor came over one afternoon with iced tea and we sat on the porch swing watching the sunset. "You look different," she said suddenly. I tilted my head slightly. "Different how?" she smiled. "Stronger," I chuckled quietly. "I don't know about stronger," I said. "Maybe just less patient with nonsense." Eleanor laughed at that. Sometimes life teaches you exactly where your tolerance should end." The months passed slowly and peacefully. Summer turned into early autumn. The magnolia leaves rustled in the breeze and the evenings grew cooler. I had almost completely stopped thinking about Gerald and Vera, not because I had forgiven them, but because my life was moving forward again. And then one afternoon in September, something happened that I never could have imagined. I was sitting at the kitchen table reading when my phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something about it looked official. I answered cautiously. "Hello," a calm male voice responded. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Ellison. My name is James Whitfield. I'm calling from Nashville regarding the estate of Mr. Harold Cosgrove." The name sounded distant in my memory. Harold Cosgrove. I closed my eyes for a second and suddenly a picture appeared in my mind. A younger version of myself standing beside a tall man in a photograph taken many decades ago. Harold Cosgrove, I repeated slowly. Yes, the lawyer confirmed. He passed away 7 weeks ago. I sat up straighter in my chair. Harold had been my first husband, briefly, more than 50 years ago. We had married young in the early 1970s and divorced quietly a few years later when our lives moved in different directions. There had never been anger between us, just distance. I hadn't spoken to Harold in decades. I'm sorry to hear that, I said softly. The lawyer paused briefly. Mrs. Ellison, Mr. Cosgrove named you as the primary beneficiary in his will. I blinked in confusion. I'm sorry what? He left the majority of his estate to you, the lawyer explained. My mind struggled to process the words. There must be some mistake, I said quickly. We divorced more than 50 years ago. No mistake, he replied calmly. Mr. Cosgrove never remarried and had no children. I felt my heart begin to beat faster. How much are we talking about? I asked carefully. The lawyer cleared his throat slightly before answering. Approximately $89 million. For several seconds I said absolutely nothing. I actually thought I had misheard him. I'm sorry, I said finally. Could you repeat that number? $89 million, he said again. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Life has a strange sense of timing sometimes. Just months earlier my husband had tried to push me out of my home with almost nothing. Now suddenly a lawyer was telling me I had inherited a fortune larger than anything I had ever imagined. Mrs. Ellison, the lawyer asked gently, are you still there? I laughed softly, a shocked kind of laugh. Yes, I said slowly, I'm here. But what the lawyer told me next about why Harold had chosen to leave everything to me was something that made the entire situation even more unbelievable. Because according to him, Harold had kept a photograph of the two of us in his desk for more than 50 years, and that photograph had never been moved. For several seconds after the lawyer said those words, I just sat there holding the phone against my ear in complete silence. $89 million. Even now, when I say that number out loud, it still feels strange. Not because money itself is magical, but because life sometimes moves in directions that are so unexpected your mind needs time to catch up. I remember leaning back in my chair and letting out a quiet sigh. Mr. Whitfield, I finally said, I think you may have just given a 74-year-old woman the biggest surprise of her life. The lawyer chuckled softly. I imagine so, he replied. Then he explained something that made the moment even more surreal. When Harold Cosgrove passed away, his attorneys had gone through his office to organize the estate documents. Inside his desk drawer they found an old photograph. It was taken in 1971 at a state park in Tennessee. The picture showed a much younger version of me standing beside Harold, both of us laughing at something outside the frame. According to the lawyer, that photograph had remained in Harold's desk for more than 50 years. He kept it with his personal papers until the day he died, Mr. Whitfield said gently. I closed my eyes for a moment when I heard that. Harold and I had been married only 4 years when we were young. Our lives simply went in different directions after that. We divorced peacefully and never spoke again. There had been no bitterness, just distance. Yet somehow through all those decades he had remembered me. Life is strange that way. Sometimes the people who quietly care about you never say it out loud. After the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time just thinking. The house was quiet except for the soft sound of the wind moving through the magnolia tree outside. A few months earlier I had been sitting at the same table wondering if I was about to lose everything I had built. And now, suddenly, life had turned completely upside down in a way I never expected. The next day Margaret drove down from Atlanta as fast as she could. When she walked through the front door, she looked at me like she was still trying to decide if the story I told her on the phone was real. Mom, she said slowly, say the number again. I laughed softly. 89 million. Margaret shook her head and sat down at the kitchen table. This is unbelievable. We spent most of that afternoon speaking with the estate lawyers and financial advisors Harold had appointed. Everything was legitimate, every document was verified, the inheritance was real. Over the next few months my life changed in ways I never imagined, but not in the way some people might think. Money doesn't suddenly make you a different person when you're 75 years old. By that age you already know who you are. Instead of chasing luxury or attention, I focused on things that actually mattered. The first thing I did was establish a trust fund for my grandchildren's education. Watching their futures become secure was far more satisfying than buying anything expensive. I also donated a large portion to the Savannah Literacy Program where I had volunteered for years. Teaching adults how to read had always been important to me, and now I had the ability to help expand that program. Patricia Holt received a letter from a new legal assistance fund a few months later. The fund was designed to help women afford strong legal representation during difficult divorces. When Patricia called me laughing after receiving that letter, I simply told her she had inspired the idea. Eleanor and I even took a trip together to Scotland the following summer. For 14 days we walked through quiet green hills, read books in small cafes, and laughed about things that had nothing to do with lawyers or courtrooms. It was one of the happiest trips of my life. As for Gerald, well, life turned out quite differently for him. The court records documenting the financial transfers became public during the case. That kind of information tends to travel quickly in professional circles. Gerald had worked for years consulting with a commercial real estate firm, but after the divorce his contracts slowly disappeared. Within a year he quietly retired and moved into a small condominium on the south side of the city. Vera moved in with him for a while. After all, they had worked so hard to build that relationship together, but relationships built on secrets and stolen money rarely last very long. 8 months later she left. I heard she moved to another city where nobody knew the story. She called me once about 7 months after everything ended. I didn't answer the phone. She left a voicemail saying she was sorry. Her voice sounded nervous, maybe even afraid. I listened to the message once and then deleted it, not because I was angry, but because some damage simply can't be repaired. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reopening a door that someone else burned down. That autumn, I planted 2 new rose bushes along the fence in my garden. The gardener who sold them to me said they could live for 50 years with proper care. 50 years, I laughed when he said that. Well, I told him, I might not be here for all 50, but I plan to enjoy as many as I can. These days I sit on the same porch swing most evenings watching the sunset behind the oak trees. The roses bloom every spring just like they always have. My life is quiet again, but it's a different kind of quiet now. A peaceful one. I'm 75 years old today, and if there's one thing life has taught me, it's this. Love without honesty is only a performance. Trust without awareness is a risk. And the people who count on you giving up, they are counting on your silence. Don't give them that satisfaction. I almost walked away from everything I had built. I almost believed the story someone else tried to write about my life. I'm very glad I didn't. Now I'd love to ask you something. If you had been sitting on that porch swing the day your husband told you he loved your sister, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. I read them all. And if this story moved you even a little, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story we share here. Thank you for listening, and wherever you are in the world tonight, I hope life surprises you in the best possible way.